Chapter 4, The Revolutionary Era. Section 2, Declaring Independence. In this section, we are going to look at the events leading up to the formal separation of the colonies from Britain. Vocabulary includes Second Continental Congress, Thomas Jefferson, Continental Army, John Adams, Bunker Hill, Loyalist, Thomas Paine, Common Sense, Virginia Declaration of Rights, and Abigail Adams. In May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress met as was planned at the First Continental Congress. New members included Benjamin Franklin, who had returned from Europe, and Thomas Jefferson. Many people still felt loyalty to the king and blamed Parliament for the issues. All delegates rejected the taxes, but only a few wanted independence at this point. While the Congress was split on whether or not they actually wanted independence at this point, they did agree that they were at war and that something needed to be done. Congress agreed to support the war effort, even though they didn't agree on the final outcome expected, and required that New England forces join in order to make a continental army. Every army needs a general. It was John Adams who suggested George Washington be the general of the Continental Army, citing him as a skilled and experienced officer from his time during the French and Indian War. July 1775, Congress issued the Declaration of Causes and Necessity in Taking Up Arms. This was a declaration or letter to England stating why they had issues, that Parliament had too much of a desire for power, and that Gage was a cruel and aggressive general. The declaration was sent to King George III of England. The writers had referred to themselves in it as faithful subjects in the colonies and had asked for the king's help in controlling Parliament's abuse of power. Instead, the king declared the colonists to be in rebellion, and Parliament banned all trade between the colonies and other nations. While the Continental Congress was still in meeting, violence was erupting throughout the colonies. A lot of it focused around Boston. At first, this was local rebellions, but as the war continued on, things became more and more violent. In what would later become the state of Vermont, there was a militia group known as the Green Mountain Boys. They followed Ethan Allen. Under his command, they were able to capture the forts of Ticonderoga and Crown Point, including others, up in the Great Lakes area. Also involved in the taking of Ticonderoga was Benedict Arnold, a name that would become infamous later, but started out the Revolutionary War as a hero. It was his idea to take the fort, and working with Ethan Allen's men, they made sure it got captured. From there, he also assisted in the shipping of Ticonderoga's cannons to Boston for colonial use. Meanwhile, after the loss at Lexington and Concord, British troops had retreated to Boston and were controlling the town. The colonial army was gathering force and surrounding it. About 15,000 militia from throughout New England had gathered to fight the British. The two sides came together at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is actually fought on Breed's Hill, but Bunker Hill for some reason becomes the name that's more famous. Gage had planned to take control of the hills around Boston first, but the colonists had beat him to it. You may remember that I mentioned before the shipping of the cannons from Ticonderoga to Boston. The Knox expedition under Colonel Henry Knox was going to do the actual transporting. It was Benedict Arnold who'd coordinate it, but Knox is the one who's going to actually move the cannons. 60 tons of cannons transported through the snow in the middle of November so that the people on Breed's Hill would have guns to fight with. The colonists were short on ammo at Breed's Hill. They did the best they could with what they had. The British army took 3 charges before they could actually capture the hill, and the colonists retreated. But it was a sore victory for the British, who lost far more people than the colonists did that day. Meanwhile, further to the north, Benedict Arnold launched an attack on Quebec in order to try to take that area from England. The attack failed, and they were forced to retreat. In the process, Benedict Arnold got shot in the leg while protecting the retreat of his soldiers. Further south, things were going better for the colonists as they continued to score victory after victory. While most colonists still considered themselves British, Parliament's laws differentiated between the British in England area and the ones in the colonies. Different laws for different areas. Colonial leaders were familiar with the philosophies of John Locke and began to institute the concept of social contract. They felt that the government's end of the social contract was not being upheld, and that entitled them to the right of independence. One key figure who was speaking out against the British occupation was British journalist Thomas Paine. He had met Ben Franklin in Europe and was invited to come take a look at the colonies. When he did, he spent 2 years, sided with the colonists, and published a pamphlet called Common Sense in early 1776. The pamphlet sold more than 100,000 copies and put forward ideas why independence was the only viable option. These are a few excerpts from the pamphlet Common Sense. In May 1776, Virginia issued the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This would be the first call for colonial independence. In addition to drawing on John Locke's views of social contract, the Declaration of Rights would also go on to influence the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights for the Constitution. The Continental Congress assembled a committee. On that committee were John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. Their job was to write up a Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had a reputation as an excellent writer, and as such was decided to be the one to actually compose the Declaration. Later editing would alter this version drastically, including the removal of an entire section against slavery. While many colonists agreed with the idea of independence, about a quarter remained loyal to England. These became known as Tories, after the Conservative Party of England. Benjamin Franklin's own son William was one such loyalist. When news of the Declaration of Independence reached Boston, John Adams' wife Abigail wrote him a letter explaining the situation. People were celebrating in the streets at the idea of independence.